Hey everybody. So I'm trying out new things, experimenting. I don't know if this looks any better or not, but it's a little bit about Reconstruction. And it has a timeline behind me from where Abraham Lincoln, uh, well, does his 10, his, this is not easy to do, by the way, his 10% plan, uh, to his assassination, to his passage of the Civil Rights Act, and all the way over here to the how do weathermen do this? The Compromise of 1877. So we are going to talk about that uh, today, which will be exciting. So the problem of Reconstruction actually starts pretty early during the war. Uh, Union forces ordered into the South had to create new local governments. By 1862, they had to create military governments in Tennessee, Arkansas, and Louisiana. And so in 1863, Lincoln announced his 10% plan, which said that if 10% of those who voted in the last national election, 1860, voted for a new Union government that repudiated the goals of the Confederacy, eliminated slavery, and swear support for emancipation, they're back in. 10%, not a large group. Now, some people weren't going to be allowed to participate in this government, and that included high-ranking officers of the Confederacy, those military officers who had abandoned their posts to support the Confederacy, and those people that had failed to treat captured African American soldiers as prisoners of war, like Nathaniel Bedford Forrest. Now, this was a very lenient plan that allowed states to come right back into the Union, partly because Lincoln wanted to start the healing process quickly. He didn't really feel like punishing the South because he felt that would just create more resentment. The problem is that there was those in Congress who thought, well, the president isn't in charge of Reconstruction. We are. And so they thought Congress should run it, not the president. And this group was known as the Radical Republicans. And they felt that Lincoln was being nice, overly generous, so that these states would vote for him for president in 1864. So in 1864, the Radical Republicans passed what they called the Wade-Davis Bill, which said that no Southern man could vote for delegates to his state's constitutional convention or be a delegate if he had fought against the Union or aided the Confederacy. Well, that's almost everybody in the South. It also abolished slaves. It abolished slavery. It also denied political rights to high-ranking Confederates, and they had to reject Confederate war debts. Now, this doesn't go anywhere because Lincoln pocket vetoed this. This means that when Congress gets a bill and then they adjourn, if the president vetoes it while they've adjourned, they can't override it because they're adjourned. And this further convinces radical Republicans that he's trying to get these states to vote for him in the 1864 election, which he really didn't need because he beats George McClellan. In 1865, Lincoln and the radical Republicans battled some more. A few radicals want to seize Confederate lands and give it to freedmen. If you've ever seen a Spike Lee movie, it's called, his production company is called 40 Acres and a Mule. And this comes from a practice or an idea that came from General Sherman, saying that we should give each freedman or freed slaves 40 acres and a mule, because most freedmen were poor with nothing but the dirt under their feet, and this would create a group of independent farmers. In March of 1865, Congress established the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, or Abandoned Lands. This is sometimes known as the Freedmen's Bureau. And their job was to rent confiscated lands to loyal Southerners and freedmen. Confiscated land sometimes was who knew whose land those belonged to. Those families might have been all wiped out. It was also in charge of feeding and clothing war refugees and drafting and enforcing labor contracts. What this meant was that if you were a freedman, you were going to get paid. They were going to make sure that Southerners tried not to pay you. They were going to make sure they did pay you. But this was as far as Congress and the president can go. So on April 14th, Abraham Lincoln goes to see a play. and he is shot and killed by John Wilkes Booth. Now, Booth had also been he had dressed as a soldier and been at John Brown's hanging. He was a devout Southerner, but he never signed up for the war. And the Booth family was probably one of the famous acting families of the time. Booth and his conspirators had thought about kidnapping Lincoln at one point. He had a chance of shooting Lincoln when Lincoln gave his last public speech on a balcony. But Booth is so well known that he can get into the president's box, shoot him from behind, and then he jumps from the president's box onto the stage, but his leg gets caught in one of the buntings, and he breaks his leg when he hits the ground. And he had yelled, "Sic semper tyrannis," which means "thus always the tyrants," which is also the Virginia state motto. Interestingly enough, you had a room full of men who were army people who all had guns, but they were so shocked at what happened that nobody did anything. They were so confused, and he was allowed to escape. Now, later, Booth is on the run. He's trapped and he's shot in a burning barn. They drag him out of the barn, and his last words, he looked at his hands and said, "Useless, useless." He was shocked by some of the reaction that he'd read in the papers about him killing Lincoln. Many Southerners thought that Lincoln was their best bet for a peaceful re-entering of the Union. 3 of Booth's collaborators were tried and hanged. These people had also planned on killing the vice president, and they almost killed William Seward, the Secretary of State. That guy got in and actually slashed Seward across the face. And so if you see earlier pictures of Seward, he's got this terrible scar. And he was unconscious for several days. And they went to tell him that Lincoln had died. And he said, I don't need to know that, because if he was alive, he would have came and visited me, and he didn't. They also hanged Mary Surratt, who owned the boarding house. Now, whether she was guilty or not, we don't know. 3 others got life sentences, including the doctor who had set Booth's broken leg. His name was Dr. Mudd. And for a long time in America, if you were in trouble, you would say, "Your name is Mudd." Mudd is in prison for a while, but there's an epidemic that breaks out in the prison. And because he's the doctor, he saves a lot of lives, and then they finally parole him. Well, there's a new president in town. His name is Andrew Johnson. He's self-educated. He's a former mayor, congressman, governor, senator, then military governor of Tennessee. He's a strong supporter of small farmers. At first, radical Republicans thought, great, Johnson's one of them, because he's always talking about Southern traders. But then Johnson will follow more of Lincoln's plan. Now, Johnson's goal is to restore white rule in the South. And this is one of those things that historians call counterfactuals. What would have happened if Lincoln had not died? What would have been the result of, would we have gone through these years of civil rights problems? Well, we'll never know, because Johnson is a white supremacist and he wants to put whites back in charge. But he also has a chip on his shoulder against the rich. He's going to punish rich farmers by not granting a pardon to anyone who fought in the rebellion and had property over $20,000. But if they were excluded from the pardon, they could come to him personally and ask for one. And Johnson just loved the fact that these rich people, who he'd never been rich, had to come to him and ask for that. In 1865, Johnson had granted about 13,000 pardons, but he also requires that states ratify the 13th Amendment. And then when Congress meets for the first time since the end of the war in December of 1865, radical Republicans are shocked. They're shocked because they look across the aisle and there's all these Southerners there. The Southerners had fought against them, and now they're sitting right back in their chairs. These traitors, as they saw them, all these high-ranking Confederates. Well, Congress is very angry. The Constitution says that Congress can deny seats to people, and so they kicked out all these legislators, these Southern legislators. In response, the South begins passing the Black Codes, regulating the freedom of African Americans and designed to keep the trappings of slavery. And the Black Codes varied from state to state. Some of the things is that you could not testify against whites in trial. You could not own property. You could not be sued. Uh, you could not sue a white man or be sued by counter sue a white man. You couldn't own farmlands in South Carolina. You couldn't own city land. If you didn't have a job, you could be sold into private service. And that means going into an annual labor contract and punished by breaking them. In other words, almost like slavery. In fact, if you go back, there's a great book by David Oshinsky called Worse Than Slavery. And it begins with Mississippi, where they passed laws saying that if you're a freedman and you're caught committing a crime like theft, it was like a $50 fine, which they did not have. And a lot of freedmen did steal because they had nothing else to feed their family. Well, you didn't have the $50, so you went to jail, but a farmer could come pay your bail, and then you would have to work off that money at that farm in servitude, personal servitude, which sounds a lot like slavery. And if you read this book, Worse Than Slavery, you see the murder rate for African Americans skyrocket. And it skyrockets because before the war, slaves were worth about $2,000 to $5,000, depending on their skills. But now these people can go and these farmers can go in and buy a slave for $50. If they get out of line, they just shoot them and go get another one. There are cases of the railroad companies building a railroad across Florida in that swampy land, which was very dangerous. And so the railroad company and the sheriff would go into a town. They would, mainly the black section of town, write down a bunch of names. That Saturday, there'd be a crime wave. They'd arrest these people, and the railroad company would come in and pay their fines, and they'd have to come and work for the railroad company, which many of them died. So just because slavery is abolished, it doesn't mean things are going to get any better. In March of 1866, Congress passes the Civil Rights Act of 1866. It said all people born in the U.S. are citizens except Native Americans. I know that sounds crazy. The idea behind this was that a lot of Northerners felt that freedmen were not getting a fair shake in the South. And there were those Northerners that really were concerned about that. They really thought that was unfair. But there were a lot of Northerners who were just as racist as the Southerners, and they felt that if freedmen didn't get a fair shake in the South, they would move north, and they didn't want them there. Well, Johnson believes that the law was beyond the reach of federal powers. He vetoes the bill, but Congress overrides it. And even some in Congress aren't sure it's constitutional. So they end up passing the 14th Amendment, which takes that Civil Rights Act of 1866 and puts it in the Constitution. By the way, in case you're wondering, Native Americans don't get citizenship until 1924. The fight between Johnson and the radical Republicans carry over into the states. In May and July, race riots break out in Memphis and New Orleans. And then in 1866, congressional elections are due to be held. And the question in this congressional election, where we're not electing a president, but just Congress, was whose policies did the public favor? Did they favor the radical Republicans or Johnson? Well, the radical Republicans win 2/3 of each house. That's important because now they can override any veto that Johnson has. His power is dramatically weakened. And so they decide they're going to put the military in charge of Reconstruction. They're going to divide the South up into 5 military districts and force the South to do additional things like pass the 15th Amendment and recognize the rights of freedmen. Now, their concern is, these radical Republicans, is that if it's under military control, that means the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, would be in charge. Now, Stanton's a radical Republican, but they're afraid that Johnson would fire Stanton and put somebody else in that position that favored Johnson's point of view and be more lenient toward the South in terms of establishing white supremacy. So Congress passes the Tenure of Office Act, which says that the president cannot remove any member of his cabinet unless the Senate approves. Now, That's questionable constitutionality-wise, but to make sure that it would uphold itself, the Supreme Court said, or the law put in there that the Supreme Court could not hear any of these cases arising under these laws. They had the power to do that because the Congress has the power to limit the appellate jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court couldn't even hear the cases. And that happened on the very same day that Texas, the Supreme Court made its ruling in the case of Texas versus White, in which it said that once you join the Union, you're stuck here. I mean, to quote it, it said that the Constitution looks forward to an indestructible union composed of indestructible states. So when people say Texas can leave the Union, they're wrong. Well, Johnson still doesn't think this law is legal, this Tenure of Office Act. So he tries to fire Stanton and replace him with Grant. Well, technically that's a violation of law. The House votes to impeach Johnson. And then he's going to be tried in the Senate. Trial in the Senate goes from March 4th to May 26th. The Senate failed to remove Johnson by one vote. And the reason is that some senators thought it would be a dangerous precedent to remove a president for purely political reasons. But after being impeached, Johnson's power is very limited. In 1868, Congress had readmitted 7 states except for Virginia, Mississippi, Texas, and Georgia. These states will also be required to pass the 15th Amendment, which gave African American men the right to vote. Legislatures in the South will be heavily Republican. This will lead to some resentment on the part of the Southern states. Southern states say that freedmen don't have the education or enough experience to be really part of the political process, which was probably true, but that was also true for millions of white voters. Freedmen will serve in every state legislature, and in South Carolina, they'll hold the majority of both houses for 2 years. We have 2 U.S. senators at this time, Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce, both from Mississippi. And we have 14 House members who are African Americans. Now, the top positions in state government went to white Republicans. The opposition called them carpetbaggers or scallywags, depending on where they were born. Carpetbaggers were northern opportunists who rushed into the South looking for opportunities after the war. Scalawags were born in the South who had opposed secession, forming a Unionist majority. Some were old Confederates who thought maybe the South should change. For example, James Longstreet. Longstreet is an interesting case. He was a general under Lee, and he was a celebrated hero. The South loved him. And then when he became a supporter of the Republicans, then all the problems of the war became Longstreet's problem. Why did we lose at Gettysburg? Longstreet, blah, blah, blah. So the Republicans, as a record, they did force shorter constitutions. They did have some greater democracy. They did reapportion state legislatures more fairly. They also paid more attention to the poor and the handicapped. Sorry about that, hiccups. Handicapped, and gave more money to state-supported schools. They also gave African Americans new freedoms, equality before the law, the right to own property, to attend schools, carry on businesses. But some Republicans members were corrupt and raised taxes to benefit themselves. So it's a mixed record. Then we get the idea of the white terror. Many Southerners cannot conceive of blacks being free of slavery. So they formed terrorist groups like the KKK, first organized in 1866 by some young men from Tennessee as a social club with costumes and secret rituals. But then they began harassing white Republicans and blacks, and soon they turned violent. Congress responded with the 3 Enforcement Acts. And the 3 parts of it are, 1, it levied penalties on a person who interfered with a person's right to vote. Elections were held under surveillance of federal marshals. And then the KKK Act, which has been used still recently too, which outlawed forming conspiracies, using disguises, resisting officers, and intimidating officials. This helps lower the incidence of KKK violence. So that's what we're going to cover today. The next time we will start just finishing up the discussion of Grant. and talking about Grant's presidency in 1868 and all the way up to Rutherford B. Hayes in 1876, and then the Compromise of 1877, and finish this class.